Rosemarie DeJarnett is the Assistant Department Chair of General Education and Distance Learning and Professor of Reading and Literacy at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. She created the Torch Lab curriculum that helps Beacon students continue working on literacy throughout their general education coursework. Dr. Wendy J. Ross is a developmental and behavioral pediatrician and director of the Jefferson Center for Autism and Neurodiversity and an associate professor at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. She's a two-time CNN hero for her work helping families with autistic and neurodiverse children. And Dr. Maureen Ruby is an associate professor and Isabel Farrington Endowed Chair of Social, Emotional, and Academic Leadership at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. Her work has focused on reading, special education, English learners, assessment, curriculum, and social emotional learning. So let's start the conversation with Rosemarie. At what point do children shift from learning to reading to learn, and how does dyslexia impact that?
So our reading to learn takes place between kindergarten and third grade, where our focus is really on phonemic awareness and phonics. And then there's this belief that there's an automatic switch. All of a sudden, after third grade, students don't need phonemic awareness and phonics instruction. They're just automatically in fourth grade, ready to start reading for information and comprehension. But what we've learned through the science of reading is that we really need to be continuing that phonemic awareness and phonics through our upper grades. Students are still needing to practice that in order to be able to read effectively. They're just using more challenging text, more challenging context, but they still need that phonemic awareness and phonics built into their curriculum. So it's not so much, we have reading to learn and then, automatically there's this switch. Instead, we really want to think about it as a continuous process.
All right, thank you. Dr. Ross, let's talk practical reading strategies. Should parents read aloud to their children? And if so, should they read aloud to them often?
Parents should always be reading aloud to their children, even in utero, if possible, before they're born, so they get used to hearing your voice. The final common pathway of reading is the ability to manipulate sounds and words. So hearing, reading, and being exposed to reading and book handling skills are really critical for future readers to be successful. And it engenders a love of reading and a passion for it, which is really important. And it also exposes children to a lot of ideas and vocabulary, which is also critical for their academic development.
So what are some tips for getting the most out of reading aloud together?
Well, when I talk to parents as a general pediatrician about reading to their children, I usually recommend that reading should be an interactive process. A lot of parents will just read, but I often have them stop, ask the child to show them things on the page, ask the child questions about their expectations about what might happen, what did happen, how a character might be feeling. And if it's a rhyming book, it's always a good opportunity to pause and see if the child can remember or come up or rhyme and, bring in that phonemic awareness piece. Reading should be a social experience. I mean, it's also nice to read more passively to a child at bedtime, but it's also great to make it an opportunity to interact with your child.
Thank you. Dr. Ruby, for younger kids, what are some small steps that parents can take that will yield big improvements in their reading?
Well, I think that I'm happy that you asked me the question about these young children because it's absolutely critical to pay attention to these early years. Maria Montessori said it best. She called children sponges. And early literacy development, as our previous speaker said, can start as early as in utero. So when we think about young kids, we think about what is called are referred to as the big four. We're talking about vocabulary and language ability, phonemic and phonological awareness, letter knowledge, and how print works. And so what parents can do is exactly what we just heard. Reading with their children and having conversations about the reading. Oral language is at the heart of learning. So talking with your students, not to your student or at them. So, for example, when you're in the grocery store, instead of just pushing the child around in the cart and throwing things in your basket, if you can just be a little bit more intentional about the experience for the child. And for example, while you all may not like avocados, I'll use that as an example. Picking up an avocado, instead of just putting it in the basket saying, wow, look at this avocado. It's so dark green. Here, hold it. I want you to feel the bumpy skin. This might be really delicious on toast. What do you think? So engaging the child in that activity. Some parents may say, I don't have time for that, but we can't not take the time for that. Looking at things in the environment, if you're driving around or walking around, when you see a stop sign, pointing it out, telling your child what it means and why it's there. And so these are just all natural things that parents can do to make language fun and a focus of the relationship.
Good advice. Rosemarie, for children who are in middle school or older, what are some strategies that parents can use to start building a solid foundation for reading?
So, one of the things I always share with parents is you want to help your child get to know themselves as a reader. Older students need just as much support as our younger students need. And as was mentioned in our discussion here, reading is a social activity. So, getting parents to talk to their student, what did you read today? Tell me about, the story that you're reading in your English composition class. We find that sometimes we think about those strategies always for our younger students, but even in college, we're always building those strategies that our students need. So focusing on filling their reading tool belt is how I like to refer to it. So if we think about all the 7 habits of effective reading, activating, inferring, predicting, questioning, we're kind of filling the reading tool belt. And so as a parent, as an educator, we want to make sure we're always thinking about that tool belt for reading and filling it with the strategies and tools that will help them be an effective reader. We also want to make sure that we're making that reading an enjoyable experience and focusing on their growth as a reader. When a student makes a jump from perhaps one text to the next, encouraging them, if they have an interest, encouraging that student to continue reading.
All right, thank you for that. So, Dr. Ross, should parents focus on fluency or speed when they're dealing with their struggling reader?
Well, I think that fluency and speed are really important components of reading, but I would never overlook the aspects of the story. In essence, it's the story that draws us to reading. I mean, fluency and speed are certainly in our tool belt, but it's the story that draws us, and it's not just the story that we're reading, but the story that we're telling ourselves and our own narratives. So speed and fluency are important because reading is sort of like a rich get richer and a poor get poorer situation. So the faster and more fluently you can read, the more you're going to be able to read. But I would never focus on that at the expense of the exciting part of reading, which is the story itself.
All right, thank you. So, Dr. Ruby, along this journey that parents and children are taking, is it important for parents to focus on emotional literacy as well when they're dealing with a child who has dyslexia?
Absolutely. So we talked about developing a love for learning. It's pretty hard to love something that you're not good at or that's really difficult for you. And so students who have dyslexia or any other learning disability can become really frustrated when they can't do what they're being asked to do or what their peers are doing, despite the fact that they're trying their best. So just like any of us, when we're not successful at something, these students can become anxious and angry. And it's important for parents and teachers to know what the students' strengths are and ensure that they're acknowledging the student's strengths when they're interacting with the child. So the idea is that we want both parents and educators or coaches to be helping the student develop a strong positive self-image. So how can we do that? So some of the ways that both parents and teachers can ensure that they're supporting the students developing self-image and their social emotional well-being are listening to the student and supporting the student in talking about their feelings rather than pushing them aside and pretending that everything is okay, because it's not. And when appropriate, we should be able to explain to the child what dyslexia is and be sure that the child understands that having dyslexia doesn't mean that they're not smart, doesn't mean that they're lazy. There's actually a national organization that's centered in Connecticut called Smart Kids with LD that offers suggestions to help support student self-image. We should compliment effort. They're trying hard, not just wait to compliment success, because success may come after some time. If your student is avoiding literacy activities because they're frustrated, make sure that you never attribute their avoidance to being lazy or not caring or not trying. We should help our children set goals that are attainable and introduce them to biographies about people who have dyslexia and what they have achieved and how they've come over their challenges, like Walt Disney or Pablo Picasso or somebody in their own school building. Celebrate all of their successes, because if you open your eyes and look past the big boulder of dyslexia, these children have many gifts and they are successful.
Thank you for that. So, Rose, in this microwave world that we live in, we want results now. And parents who are going on this journey with their child may grow frustrated that the youngster doesn't get on grade level overnight. Must parents set realistic expectations as they navigate this journey with their kids?
Absolutely. So, one of the things I see with my college students who have dyslexia is they say that no one understood them. And they share feelings of frustration, how they're self conscious, it just has depleted their confidence. And so, one of the things that I think is critical is setting those realistic goals. I once heard somebody say, it's reading, it's not rocket science, but it is. Reading is just like rocket science. There is so much that goes into reading. And just like sometimes that rocket ship doesn't take off the first time, there's scrubs, there's trials to get it right. Reading takes the same thing with students. We've got to be willing to try different programs, try different things that might work for that individual student until we really find what helps that student. And the big piece is to focus on their growth. A lot of times we tend to focus in on a grade level. Oh, you're reading at a third grade reading level. But that really works from like a deficit model, what you're not doing to be on grade level. Instead, by focusing on their strengths, by focusing on those small steps towards growth, that's going to help that student who has dyslexia not feel disengaged, not feel frustrated, but be able to recognize that I'm making my own strides in my time and I will get there and I will be successful in my way.
All right. Dr. Ross, it's natural that children are going to struggle as they go through this process. So is it important for parents to try to build confidence in the child by steering them to something that they do well and that they enjoy and that they find success in?
Absolutely. It's really important that every child feels like they have an island of strength, and not just strength, but something that they might be actually excelling in. You know, there's this amazing book called The Dyslexic Advantage, where it talks about how people who who have dyslexia, who maybe are not quite the linear thinkers, actually make huge contributions to society because their minds are different. And, you know, in a time, especially today, when we see there's so many challenges, there's a pandemic, there's war, there's, you know, climate change, that it really does take all kinds of minds. And so to nurture the way your child's mind works and to have them engage in their story from a position of where they feel powerful and like they're an agent and not just something or someone that's behind is really critical to their success. Critical.
Dr. Ruby, some moms and dads are going to feel intimidated when they're asked to become teachers at home, helping to support their dyslexic learners. Are there some strategies you could suggest that will make learning at home more easier for parents to get through?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that parents need to be parents first. The child needs unconditional love, needs to know that they can come to you as a parent and that you'll be there for them no matter what. So our first role is to be a parent, not the teacher. That's my opinion. As we talked earlier, oral language is key. So that's from birth forward. So speaking with and not at your child is important for many, many reasons. Some of the things that you can do is take field trips, to use language, to talk about the things that children see in museums or at zoos or any place that you would take your child to, so that you're building background knowledge and building vocabulary, because this is important for them in terms of their comprehension when they are able to decode words. And if you can make connections with things that are in their curriculum, all the better. And don't forget about virtual field trips, saying that, well, I can't go here, I can't go there. There are a lot of places that you can go to virtually. The time that you spend with your child as a parent should not be stress-inducing for either your student or for you. We talked about reading to your child in the early years when they don't read yet, setting up that knowledge about books and how they work and how language works. Reading to your child when they're young and older is a very important strategy that people kind of overlook. When your child is in older grades and they're unable to read a text that would be for their grade level, you can get a recording of that and not just give it to your child. Listen to the recording with your child. You can read alternate pages in books. You can read chorally, you can read together. Playing language games like memory or tall tales or go fish or zingo or sound bingo or rhyming games, tongue twisters, listening to music. If your child is younger, Raffi and Charlotte Diamond are two artists that have a lot of music that plays with the sounds of language and supports phonemic awareness. I mean, what about when, well, I don't want to date myself, but some of us were kids and we had the name game, Shirley, Shirley, Bo Burley, Banana, Fana, Fo Furley, that we were actually learning phonemic awareness. So as for teaching, parents could be advised to make sure they set up a nurturing place in their home, a quiet place where students can study and where they can practice with their students what the teachers, the specialists have been teaching at school. You can help your child to become organized. Teach them organizational skills will go a really long way in helping their learning. Teach your children to be good to him or herself. Teach your child to be good. Teach them how to enforce self-care for themselves. Resting, taking breaks, playing, getting plenty of sleep and eating well, and then praise their self-care. Because these are skills that are going to support their becoming good students.
All right. Well, Dr. Ross, should parents include their child in the interactions at school regarding their accommodations and their academic standing? And if so, why?
I really feel like this is an age-dependent question. I feel like when children are younger, it's probably, they may not understand some of what's going on around them. Maybe they could be included in a limited capacity. I think a lot of times adults sometimes forget children are there and talk about them perhaps in a negative way that would concern me for a younger child to be in the room. Unfortunately, I find, and I would be interested if the other panelists find this too, that sometimes when children have learning disabilities like dyslexia, they're kind of blamed for it. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think as children get older and they have more agency over their futures, over choosing their classes, over maybe planning a career path for themselves, and when they have more of a voice and can assert themselves, I think it is really critical that they are at those meetings, because learning to self-advocate is a really important part of having any learning disability. because time and time again, they will be called upon to self-advocate. So as a younger child, that would concern me a little bit. But as we get older, I think self-advocacy is really as important as some of these other things in your literacy tool belt that have been spoken of.
Well, I'm going to follow up with what Dr. Ross was asking. Rosemarie, what have you been finding in this regard?
So we absolutely want to add advocacy to that tool belt because in the college setting, I want my students with dyslexia to not just survive. I want them to thrive. And so if they know themselves as a learner, if they're able to advocate for themselves with their professors and say, I use assistive technology, I use a speech to text, I use an app, and this is how it helps me. Not only are they advocating for themselves, but they're also helping that professor, that educator, learn about different pieces that they may not be aware of. And so to me, that advocacy is extremely important. I see my college students here on campus use graphic organizers to help them manage the content, manage the reading load in order to be able to thrive. Again, not survive, but to really be able to feel like they're making that growth, that they're doing what they need to in their classes, that they're, so many times we think of, I'm not reading like the other students are in class. We see that a lot in those IEP meetings. And instead, I want students to be able to advocate for themselves, communicate about their learning need with dyslexia, lean on campus resources like their campus writing center. They shouldn't have to struggle and become frustrated because they're editing a paper. They can use their college's writing center and be able to get help with that editing piece so that that spelling isn't a worry. Instead, they know how to use those resources to help show in their work their very best.
And last but not least, Dr. Ruby, you have any thoughts on this?
I actually am an advocate of having students learn to advocate for themselves in those IEP meetings. And I'll just share one quick vignette where I was in a meeting once with a student, and when the child was given the opportunity to say something, she looked at her specialist teacher and said, I know you really like to use this strategy. And she explained it. She goes, but that's not really what helps me the most. What would be really helpful would be if you would, and she explained it. And every adult at that table just took pause at the reasoning that the child gave. And the IEP was changed because children need to let us know what's working for them and what isn't. And I think that we have a tendency, as has already been stated, to blame kids and not really respect the fact that it's about them. And they need to learn at as early as appropriate age to be able to speak up for themselves and do that for the rest of their lives.
Thank you. So, Rosemarie, I wanted to circle back. You kind of touched on this in your previous answer, but when dyslexic children go on to college, independence is focused on in college, and the reading material gets more challenging and it ratchets up. So talk to me a little bit more about some ways that college kids can thrive and not survive once they hit the college campus.
So I think one of the main keys is that communication. We want them to be advocates for themselves. We want them to be able to communicate not only with their professors, but also when they're working and collaborating with their peers, to feel comfortable to say to that peer, I may not feel comfortable perhaps reading that in front of the class during a presentation, but one of my strengths is putting the presentation together, pulling that professional piece. So I'd like to work on that part and maybe not have the speaking part because I'm not yet comfortable with that. So really being able to communicate, understanding themselves as a learner. So that's one of the things we really focus on here on campus is getting to know yourself as a reader. And so we really reinforce if they're using assistive technology, they're using an audiobook, you are still reading. Reading requires thinking. So if you're listening to that audio text and you're responding by completing a graphic organizer and showing your thinking, and bringing that graphic organizer to class so that you can participate in the discussion. So really building those tools to help them feel strong as a learner. Really just focusing on what resources are available. And I think what Dr. Ruby said is the most beautiful part, helping that student understand that they are in charge of their learning. We want to listen as an educator, as a parent, we want to listen to our students and our children and hear what is working for them and continue that. And if something isn't working, take that into consideration as well and work to find something else.
Thank you. And Dr. Ruby, since Rosemarie name checked you, I'm going to give you the final word today. Any parting words for parents who are trying to raise up their dyslexic learners?
Yes. The first thing I would say is trust yourself. Trust yourself as a parent. You know your child best, and you need to be an advocate for your child so that your child has you as a model for advocacy. So if somebody tells you, oh, don't worry, it's developmental, he or she just needs more time, or, oh, he isn't focused or isn't trying, or as I was told once, some kids just don't learn to read. Your child is an academic. Huge red flag should go up for you as a parent. In this journey, you have to protect your own social emotional status. So try and connect with other parent groups in your area as a resource. Now, I mentioned one, Smart Kids with LD, is a great resource for parents and students, but each state, if you go on the state's websites, has parent support centers. The International Dyslexia website has some resources. There are resources out there. You do not have to do this on your own. I talked a bit about organizational skills and self-care for children, but parents, self-care is just as important for you as it is for your child. And so think about who's your best self? Who is your best self when you're not stressed out? What are the characteristics that you have as a human being, a caring parent, when you're not stressed out? And take note of these, write them down. And when you become overwhelmed, because you will become overwhelmed when your child's having a particularly tough day, or before you go to a school meeting, take a deep breath and review who you are in your best self, and then go forward. And remember, you've got this. Trust yourself.
Well, Rosemarie DeJarnett, Dr. Wendy J. Ross, and Dr. Maureen Ruby, thank you for joining us today, and thanks for the knowledge.